Welcome to Gleaning and Gathering. This is Eric Heimlich again, your host, and I'm here today with Kaylynn Heimlich for a follow-up interview. And the reason that I wanted to do this interview, first of all, it was a lot of fun last time, so I wanted to do it again. But I also wanted to give her an opportunity to come back with a little more detail, because our last interview was so cut up, and I edited a great deal, left some things in, cut a lot of things out.
Hallelujah.
But I edited it in such a way that it really made you sound like you didn't want to answer the question of philosophy of education. You said something to the effect of, "You can't ask me that." And the reason...
Sorry, Mrs. Stratton.
The reason was not because you didn't want to answer the question, but it was because you had just finished writing a paper on this very topic. And so you had a lot of thoughts on it, but you didn't have the paper with you, and you didn't want to really go into that whole...
Yes, I didn't know how to dive in all at once.
Right.
And it had been a minute, and I had kind of set it aside from my brain.
So we're here today to kind of give you an opportunity to address that.
Yes. Here we are.
Giving you some questions, and read through your paper. Very good paper, by the way, entitled Building Bridges for Time and Eternity, My Philosophy of Education. Yeah. Incredibly astute paper. But the first thing that I wanted to get to, your whole philosophy of education. Can you kind of describe that in brief, and then we're going to go into a few of the more in-depth details that you share in your paper. But kind of just give us the nutshell version.
So I think specifically as I was beginning to formulate my philosophy of education, the thing that kept coming back was this idea of worldview. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really love the words worldview.
Yeah.
Word.
Is there a reason?
The reason primarily being that using those words makes it seem like every point of view is valid. Which...
So you have your worldview. I have my worldview.
Yes.
All worldviews are basically equal.
Yes. This is just the way I see the world. And anyways, which I understand they're not, some worldviews are clearer than others. There's that analogy continues and it's fine. But the way that I continued to, as I was thinking about it, I think, and I mentioned this a little bit in the last one, the idea of learning what to love is a clearer understanding of that. And when we learn what to love, it shapes the way that we see everything. So there's value in both analogies, but I would frame it more in the words what to love.
So in your paper, you pointed out that education is about shaping how the student processes the world mentally, morally, and aesthetically. How does that begin? How does the shaping of one's worldview begin in your mind?
See, this paper was on the philosophy, meaning just the ideas. I'm not entirely certain how this all works out, but I think, so the pictures that would have come up in my mind specifically as I was writing it is initially everything is shaped by your picture of the home. You can understand love before you understand the word love. You can understand what trust is before those ideas are a part of the pictures that equal father, or mother, or all of those things are the words we eventually use for them, are the ideas for them are formed long before that. So I think a worldview initially is formed in the home. And teachers, fortunately or unfortunately, are given the byproduct of that from the time that they're born until the time that they're 5 years old or 2 years old, whatever. Never mind. Not that rabbit trail.
Well, you talk about Christian education is about coming alongside parents. Why is that? So just to kind of play devil's advocate for a minute, if teachers really know what's best, why not just teach what you think is best?
God gave the responsibility of teaching, of training your children up in the Lord to parents. This is something that I came to kind of almost begrudgingly, no, not really. I was doing a paper, I think it was in high school, on Christian education and the importance of it. So I went to scripture and I said, I want to know what God says about Christian education. And it's important, obviously, right? And the more that I looked, the more I was like, there's nothing about formal Christian education. The idea of parents training their children is all over and is important, like very important. So I had to finally get to the point where, well, my paper doesn't really have much to go on that direction. Not that I don't believe that Christian education is biblical. I think there is a place for supporting parents.
You mean?
Yes, I don't think that it's unbiblical. I think there's a place for support to parents in training their children from the community that God has given them.
Sure.
I think community is definitely in scripture. I think training is definitely in scripture. Discipleship is in scripture. So all of those put together, I think you can make a solid case that Christian education is important. However, if Christian schools think that they are going to take the place of the parents in that process, we have a major problem.
Right. No, and I think that's it's an important point. Because really, as one person said, and I can't remember who it is now, but the family is God's first curriculum.
Yes.
That it is the way in which God begins training from the day one's born. Parents are teaching, and there's teaching that's going on long before any kind of formal educational process. And so there are obviously, a number of specializations. And so, we have car mechanics. We don't all make our own clothes. And so it's natural that in this world of specialization, there would be some people who would focus in on the idea of education as a specialization, but with the understanding that the buck stops with the parents.
Yeah.
And that ultimately it's about parents teaching their children, and then Christian education coming alongside and partnering with parents.
Yes.
Engaging students mentally, morally, and aesthetically. You talk about that in your paper a little bit. That it's mentally how to think, morally distinguishing right and wrong, and then aesthetically appreciating beauty and knowing what constitutes something as desirable. Talk about that for a little bit. What does that mean? So
there's another section of the paper that describes it as engaging the brain, empathy, and practical skills.
Okay.
Which aesthetically, I'm not sure that that's exactly practical skills. Anyways, I think it means that education has to recognize that a child is much more than a brain. And so developing them through the use of things like music.
Okay.
Reading stories, recognizing that stories are incredibly important. I should probably stop harping on that, but recognizing also that your exercises in the sciences and all of the STEM, that whole learning section is incredibly important. So I think you can go, there's a pendulum on everything, and you can go one way or the other on all of these issues. And I think for a while we've gone the whole like STEM is it.
Yeah.
And then people are realizing like, no, that's not actually. So now we have STEAM where we're adding the arts back in. There
a steam engine.
There's recognition of the areas in God's world that we can take dominion, and that God has given each child a way that they are seeing the world that is unique.
Yeah.
No one else has been given exactly that point of view, which is so beautiful, so incredibly beautiful. But it also means that there's pieces that if we just try to, and I want to say this carefully, if we try to put a child in a box and say, you're supposed to be like this, then that doesn't end up putting them in a box doesn't round them as as the person that's going to be the continual learner and ultimately a child, like we want to Lewis says in the in Screwtape Letters, Lewis is talking, he's obviously talking from Screwtape's perspective. And he talks about how the enemy wants to really genuinely does want to create these loathsome little creatures that are little images of himself on the earth. And that picture of God truly wanting to make us in his image, and that we would grow to be creative like him and to love the good and the beautiful and the true, and to have his justice a fire in our heart. And all of those things, when that comes to the classroom, end up giving meaning to something like geometry. And giving meaning to all of history, when you recognize that history and the Bible happened at the same time. Like, what? When you begin to weave this meta narrative that God has created to glorify himself. So I think practical steps of what that looks like is going outside. Random, but true. I think kids need to be outside, and being able to just have wonder through stories and through experiences with others, through serving, and then giving meaning to the everyday math, English, spelling. All of those have meaning and significance that don't necessarily go away if you're just teaching them in a regular classroom setting, but framing them in a way that allows the child to recognize. They might not recognize that moment, but eventually recognize that this has allowed me to then go on and learn the things that I uniquely want to know about the rest of the world.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think, teaching so that they can play the game. You talk about that on page 3 there. So that ultimately every student has the opportunity to either accept or reject whatever truth is presented. And I was curious about that because there's a lot today that passes for education that really is indoctrination and endeavoring to get these young skulls full of mush to just buy into whatever it is that we're wanting them to buy into. And so is this idea of agency or free will really necessary to real education instead of indoctrination, that we're actually preserving a young person's ability to opt in or opt out and endeavoring to sell, if you will, this worldview, and at the same time recognizing that they may choose to reject this truth that we are presenting to them, but that we cannot and must not just force it upon them and say, this is what you're going to do. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That is an interesting question. I'm not sure that I would have. This is such an interesting question. And I don't know that I've thought about it enough to say, I know that I've seen it. I've seen it happen. And I've seen the difference giving. So, okay. I think it comes down that whole idea is efficacy. This is something that even in public schools, we recognize that it's absolutely necessary for a child to succeed in life past just the 12 grades, and even in high school specifically. You have to have the idea that what I do will affect the outcome. Because of those. So that idea of free will is innate in our educational programs. In public education, this is overt. So it's overt. I will just put it there. But in Christian education, this happens a lot too. You are taught to just fill in the answers. And I think it's important, especially in younger grades, to teach children things without question marks. Such as my love for them. That doesn't change based on the day. That God's love for them doesn't change based on the day. And giving them, so presenting truth, I think there is a danger in endeavoring to, quote, educate and not indoctrinate, of giving kids more question marks than they can handle. I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a danger, I think, in any kind of education, to giving students both too much information,
yes,
and not enough.
Not enough. Yeah.
If you start in kindergarten with pre-calculus, you've got problems because there's just not the information there to work with to be able to deal with the f of x at that point. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there's never a point at which 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
Those fundamentals will always hold true,
yes.
even through calculus.
Yeah.
And so if you can start with the fundamentals mm-hmm. and build on that, there's more and more that a student can and will learn mm-hmm. That will build on that good foundation. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're trying to do, especially in elementary education, is endeavoring to establish that firm foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right is always right.
Yes.
Wrong is always wrong. 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah.
All those things that are important to being able to build a solid future. Mm-hmm. And so this common indoctrination today that you can question everything, mm-hmm. well, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't and build a world or a worldview. There are some things that you have to be able to know, that words have meaning, or else your whole argument and the ability to argue is...
The only thought that should be stopped is the thought that stops thought.
Yeah. Well, it's a challenge because as we're talking about things that people question, talking about those things will bring up questions. Mm-hmm. And so for some people, that's going to undermine or could undermine their faith.
And I think so valuing questions, as I'm looking at it, I'm seeing it a little more clearly. Valuing questions is not the same as always saying that there are just questions. Mm-hmm. There are questions, but there are also answers. And allowing your children to question well, question respectfully, question all kinds of things, and then giving them clear, thought out, biblical answers gives them eventually a sure footing to be able to continue questioning for the rest of their life. And questions are how you learn. It's part of curiosity. So yeah, I think kids need a firm foundation to jump off of, and then giving them the confidence to be able to say, there's answers out there and I'm going to look for them.
Yeah. And I think that that's a challenge to mm-hmm. strike that balance, because if we're not careful, as parents and as educators, we just want them to come to the same conclusions we've come to.
Yeah.
And we'll do whatever we have to do to put the guardrails up mm-hmm. in our minds to keep them from all kinds of places that, that they could go wrong.
Yeah.
And so in doing that, if we're not careful though, we can take away agency mm-hmm. in a way that ultimately pushes them towards the very thing we're trying to keep them mm-hmm. from. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a balance, but I think it's a balance that we can strike. And
So you use a great illustration here in your paper of this idea of the bridge builder. Could you expand on that a little bit? You say instruction is about the initial construction of the bridge between what kids know right now and what they need to know by the end. Equipping is about giving the students the tools that they'll need to get all the way across the bridge. Application is about painting the picture of life on the other side of the bridge. Support is about walking the road with your students and giving them the activities as well as the courage to continue. And then planning is kind of the blueprint drawing of all that needs to be done. That's a great illustration, but what does that look like in education?
I'm trying to think. This came from a book that Mrs. Stratton had us read. I highly recommend Foundations of Education by Joanna Stratton, if you are interested in taking an online course.
Yes.
or reading the book 7 Laws of a Learner by Bruce Wilkinson.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a fantastic book for educators and parents and all of the above. So initially, this whole idea comes from the book 7 Laws of a Learner, and its foundation is that it is the teacher's responsibility to cause the students to learn. Mm-hmm. So because of that, as a teacher, it is your responsibility. This is balanced by the fact that it is the student's responsibility to learn. If you are a student, it is your responsibility to learn. Period. Anyways, there have been so many times in my college classes that I've been like, well, it's the teacher's responsibility to cause me to learn. Anyways, It is my responsibility. But
any teachers that you want to name particularly? I'm just kidding.
But this responsibility ends up needing a lot of, it is not a single moment of time where a child's just like, boom, you have learned. You are now learned. There's a process that your vision has to be followed by intention and means. Right. What you see a child at the end of 12 years, what is the person that you hope will actually exit this program or this my household? Who do you want to leave your household? That picture, I think there's pictures all over scripture of what that child should look like. But that picture educationally of what that child should look like should motivate you in every area, down to the first day they walk into the classroom. What are they experiencing? What are they seeing? What are they going to be doing? How are they going to be sitting in your classroom? It motivates everything. So that then breaks down into your classroom management strategy and your instructional pattern, the kind of instruction that you do.
That's the means.
Those are the means, yeah. But your initial vision is what needs to spark all of that. So you see the other end of the bridge. You see that the child eventually will get here. But if you try to share with them now,
right, it's too much.
No, yeah, exactly. There's not.
Yeah, and I think that in talking about curriculum, and you finish your paper by talking about that, curriculum should be individualized, Christ-centered, with an emphasis on beauty, joy, and the truth of Scripture. This provides...
Did I write that?
Yeah, you did. Provides a framework for the rest of the learning process.
Yes.
And the curriculum, for most teachers that I've experienced in the past, the curriculum is the learning process. But you're kind of pointing to something that goes beyond just what's happening in the classroom. That this curriculum is a framework for the rest of the learning process. Could you talk a little bit about that? What does that look like?
Curriculum would include all of the aspects of your classroom that are not necessarily connected to instruction. This would include things like the books that you bring in. This is a lot. So what I mean is that it's a lot more than just the teacher's manual that you have on the desk or the textbooks that they are given. Curriculum includes a lot of like the playground equipment that you have. Not really. I don't know. There's a lot of pieces to curriculum that should guide, but should also give the teacher freedom to take the moments of learning that happen in the classroom, the moments of epiphany that happen in the classroom, and expand on those to give students a fire and a desire for more learning in that direction. So if a teacher is just given like, teach this textbook, you have to be able to do that to get everything that is in the textbook while also grabbing the kids' hearts and helping them truly understand what's going on inside the words that the textbook is giving them. I think a danger on the other end is not, this would be the danger that I have, is not being controlled by the textbook at all. Because your textbook actually, or your curriculum, I should say, all of it together, the curriculum that your school gives you has thought through, at least a good curriculum, has thought through all of the pieces from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, meaning that there are little things that happen inside that, unless you have experienced it multiple times, and seasoned teachers have, but if you leave parts of that out, you're actually leaving out chunks that are scaffolding for the next level that the students are going to need. This is one of the reasons that switching curriculums is really difficult. It can be done, and has been done effectively by many teachers and homeschool moms and everything like that. Homeschool parents, sorry. But it's very difficult because a good curriculum will look at the whole range and build in the pieces that are needed to get to the eventual goal.
So if you switch builders in the middle of building your house,
yeah, it can happen. It works.
It can work. You can still get a house at the end of the day, but the first guy may have had a different thought about where he was going than the second guy. So you end up with things that are different.
Yeah.
I think, though, that the idea that curriculum is ultimately teaching to the test, and I'll put that in capital letters. You end the paper by saying, but rather when teachers walk into the pearly gates, they will be lauded for one thing and one thing only. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord. As teachers, let us live in such a way as to make that a reality. That we're ultimately, whatever else we're teaching to the test. The test that will ultimately be for eternity. And that, as your paper is entitled there, Building Bridges for Time and Eternity, that what we're imparting is more than just information. It's not just ready to learn, ready to earn, as the United Way's slogan for education was a few years back. That we're teaching for something bigger. That we're teaching for not just even developing a worldview here, but for them to see the 10,000 year view.
Yeah. The beauty of, I think in that specific section of the paper, my desire was more, we are teaching for time and eternity, but we are living for time and eternity as well. And I think educators a lot of times get focused on the results. And definitely results are important. You need to analyze, you need to recognize where you need to go next, how to do things better. I don't mean that at all. But we get focused on the numbers or how many degrees we have, all of the pieces of education that 10,000 years from now actually won't mean anything. But the thing that will mean something is that God says, you did well. Like, you were faithful with the child that never really got it or cared. You were faithful with all the little ones, all of the least of these. And so, teaching to the test, both for them and for you, I think is what teaching is all about.
Yeah. Well said. Well, thank you again for taking time to come on the podcast, and it's always great to sit down with you and talk about these things, and great to have you home. This is our last day to have Kaylynn home.
It's true.
And so we're trying to fit a lot in today, but thanks for taking time out of your packing to join us here. So for Gleaning and Gathering, God bless.